Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Amy Taylor. I'm the Public Outreach and Events Manager for the Indiana Civil Rights Commission. Today marks the 16th annual Holocaust Observance, and today we are so happy that we will also be adding the names reading ceremony. To get the afternoon started, I'd like to welcome Mr. Clayton Graham, who is the chair of the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Indiana Holiday Commission.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Clayton Graham. I'm chair of the Dr. Martin Luther King Indiana Holiday Commission. On behalf of the Commission, I'm honored to welcome you to the 16th annual Holocaust Day of Remembrance. This year's program is titled Honoring Our Families, a fitting theme as we embark on the National Holocaust Week of Remembrance. I would also like to recognize our Governor, Governor Mike Pence, our Mayor, Indianapolis Mayor Greg Ballard, State Treasurer Richard Murdoch, Attorney General Greg Zeller, Senator Tom Weiss, other members of the Indiana General Assembly, all other elected and appointed officials, honored guests, friends, and Hoosiers. Thank you for taking time to remember the victims of the tragic period known as the Holocaust. Unfortunately, due to ISTEP testing this week, we were unable to offer our educational youth summit this morning. Traditionally, we offer an educational youth summit for students grades from 6th through 8th. The students take part in the programming in the morning at the Indiana Government Center and are brought over here to take part in this program. With that said, we look forward to offering our educational youth summit again next year. I want to thank our sponsors, the Indiana Civil Rights Commission, the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Indiana Holiday Commission, the Indianapolis branch of the Jewish Relations Council, the Indianapolis Bureau of Jewish Education. We are truly thankful for your support. Without your support, this program would not be possible. And at this time, I'd like to call Jamal Smith, Executive Director of the Indiana Civil Rights Commission, to the podium.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. All right. Again, my name is Jamal Smith, Executive Director of the Indiana Civil Rights Commission, and I want to, if you allow me to, just briefly thank a few people. First of all, Judge Brown, I'd like to thank you and the rest of the Holiday Commission for your guidance and support. It allows us to continue to put on events like the Holocaust Remembrance today, as well as the MLK celebration that we do towards the beginning of the year. I'd like to also thank Lindsay Mintz, the JCC, as well as our partners at the Indianapolis Jewish Community Relations Council as well, and to thank and welcome Michelle Anderson, who is also now a part of the team. We certainly appreciate the long-standing support. It is because of that partnership that we are allowed to kind of take our hands off the steering wheel a bit and make sure that this event is pulled off in the manner in which it is every year. So certainly appreciate you guys for the support. I'd like to thank the staff of the Indiana Civil Rights Commission for all the work that you do, because it's the manpower and the labor that allows these things to be pulled off. So certainly appreciate it, and certainly don't want to minimize the work that you do. Special thanks to our governor, Pence, as well as our mayor, Mr. Greg Ballard, for being here as well, and to the rest of our elected and appointed officials who take the time. You guys have busy schedules, and I certainly do understand and appreciate that. So thank you for taking the time out to be here this afternoon. And then thank each and every one of you for being here today. Many may know that Congress established the Days of Remembrance as the nation's annual commemoration of the Holocaust. This is a time to honor the victims and reaffirm the right to all people to be treated equally with dignity and respect. And I just want to highlight, last night under the direction of Clinton and the crew at the JCC, took part in a program, and it was kind of a commemoration of the events of the Holocaust as well. And in addition to that commemoration, I think one of the most moving pieces, at least for me, was to be able to look across the room and recognize the amount of diversity that was there. Of course, you had folks of Jewish descent. You also had people of German descent. You had Catholics. You had Christians. You had Sikhs. You had Muslims. You had black folks. You had white folks. You had Asian, Hispanic, Latinos. You had men, you had women, you had young, you had old. And to me, as a director of the Indiana Civil Rights Commission, that was a true embrace of what we are actually here to do. I say time and time again that at the Commission, we are in the business of putting ourselves out of business. And it's events like this and the one last night that, all moments about that are actually happening. But it at least helps us to move in the right direction. So again, thank everyone for being here today, for the support. I ask that you continue to support this and other events like it. God bless you and enjoy the rest of the day.
I'd now like to ask Ms. Jenny Payne, who serves as the Central Indiana Regional Director from Senator Dan Coates' office. She brings greetings.
Dear friends, thank you for the invitation to join the 16th Annual State of Indiana Holocaust Observance. I regret that I could not join you, but I appreciate the opportunity to commemorate the lives lost as a result of the Holocaust. As a staunch advocate for our Jewish allies, I believe remembrances such as these play a crucial role in reminding people about the devastating loss of life in the concentration camps. While serving as U.S. Ambassador to Germany, I was able to see the tragic aftermath of the Holocaust firsthand. I truly appreciate your work to memorialize the lives that were lost. I trust that today's observance will be a moving and powerful experience for all in attendance. Thank you, and sincerely, Dan Coates, United States Senator.
At this time, I'd like to call your attention to the video screen that we have here. We have a short video entitled Why We Remember the Holocaust. This was provided to us from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum.
As we remember those whose lives were lost in the Holocaust, we're confronted by the question, could it have been prevented? While at the time, few saw that the events of 1938 were leading to the Holocaust, there were warning signs. Can our understanding of these events help us anticipate and prevent genocide in our own time?
(1938) is such a key year because it marked an escalation both of the persecution of the Jews, the violence against Jews. It became more widespread. It also marked an escalation of the Nazi policy of expansion. This is where we can see all the dominoes begin to fall.
From the time that Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power in 1933, German Jews had gradually seen their rights as citizens stripped away, and their employment options severely limited. But in those early years of the Third Reich, no one could imagine the physical annihilation of the Jews of Europe.
My parents and a lot of other of that generation tried to ignore it. They said, oh, this isn't going to last. This man is crazy. It's not going to last. Well, they were wrong.
An initial warning sign of 1938 came in mid-March when Germany annexed neighboring Austria, an act known as the Anschluss. Within hours, an explosion of violence engulfed the Jewish population in Vienna. It spread throughout Germany in the following months, accompanied by new anti-Jewish legislation. Jews no longer felt safe and tried to get out while they could.
Beginning in March 1938, you have a real push for the first time since 1933 in Germany of large numbers of people trying to get out at any cost, even if they had to give up all of their assets.
But despite official Nazi policy demanding that the Jews leave Germany, emigration was not a simple matter.
My parents really tried to leave, but where to go? We had some very distant relatives in the United States and some friends, but we needed an affidavit. And even if you had an affidavit, there was a quarter number.
There are several reasons why governments didn't open their doors. The main one is cold, calculated self-interest. In the United States, looking to the issues that were on the front burner in this country, the Depression, the widespread isolationism of the American population, anti-Semitism.
The United States was not alone in its refusal to raise its immigration quota.
Many of the world's governments showed sympathy for the plight of the Jews in Germany and also showed obviously concern for Nazi intentions elsewhere in Europe. But few were willing to take significant steps to meet either crisis.
This became clear in July of 1938 at the Evian Conference, convened by President Franklin Roosevelt to address the growing humanitarian crisis faced by German Jews.
With the exception of the Dominican Republic, every single country refused to open its doors to expand its immigration quotas.
Over the summer of 1938, Germany threatened to invade Czechoslovakia to take control of the Sudetenland, a western border region where the majority of the population was ethnic German. Unprepared for war, Great Britain, France, and Italy agreed to let Germany annex the Sudetenland in an attempt to guarantee peace.
This was a cause for great jubilation in much of Europe because it was believed that war had been forestalled or prevented altogether. Other Europeans realized, though, that this was just Germany flexing its muscles and seeing whether or not the world would back down.
And soon, Nazi policy toward Jews became even more aggressive. On November 9th and 10th, the Nazi Party unleashed a wave of anti-Jewish violence throughout Greater Germany.
Kristallnacht, the Night of the Broken Glass, represents the first national, organized, physical attack on the Jews. It was a very public event. Germans saw it happening, and many participated in it.
I saw the smoke and the fire of the synagogue burning, and both of us, my sister and I, started screaming from fear.
Mid-morning came a horde of people to the door, just smashed the door down, came in with scissors and all kinds of instruments and just demolished the whole apartment.
It was so dreadful when my mother went into the house that she, at that point, internalized what was going to happen to us and to all the other Jews.
To me, this was the true beginning of the Holocaust.
German police rounded up about 30,000 Jewish men and held them in concentration camps. In the weeks that followed, German authorities closed Jewish communal organizations and schools and forced Jews to sell their businesses, property, and stocks to non-Jews, usually at a great loss.
I mean, no more business, no more income, nothing. The business was closed. They just put things in front of it, plywood or whatever it was, they nailed it down. So nobody could come in anymore.
In spite of the escalating violence, very few nations, individuals, or groups chose to help. Those who did made a difference. A small group of British and German Jews persuaded the British government to allow unaccompanied Jewish children to enter the United Kingdom under a program known as the Kindertransport.
It's a poignant success story because these are children who were, their families put them on these trains to get out of harm's way, knowing full well that they might never see their children again, and in many cases didn't see their children. But the children survived. These were 10,000 lives that were rescued.
As 1938 ended, Nazi Germany's intentions were increasingly clear. In the coming year, Germany would occupy the Czech lands and invade Poland, igniting World War II. Efforts to rescue Jews, such as the Kindertransport, were effectively shut down. Looking back at the events of 1938, the signs of impending war and the Holocaust are clearer today than they were then. Unfortunately, acts of genocide have continued into the 21st century. But there's hope that the world has begun to heed the warning signs.
We've learned enough, we've seen enough, we've studied enough, the case of the Holocaust and the cases since the Holocaust, to understand what those signs are.
The choice is not just between sending in the 101st Airborne and doing nothing. There's diplomatic efforts, there's intelligence, there's financial sanctions. There's a range of different things that governments can do to prevent genocide.
The thing that we need to be conscious of is how quickly these events can develop into an act that cannot be undone. And so why not take preventative steps early on so that we're not dealing with the effects of true mass violence and genocide?
At this time, I'd like to bring Shelby Anderson, President of the Indianapolis Jewish Community Relations Council, to the podium.
Good afternoon. My name is Shelby Anderson, and I'm privileged to be serving as the board president of the Indianapolis Jewish Community Relations Council. That was such a powerful movie as an aside, and I just returned a month ago from Israel with my 4 children. And the discussion of humanity sort of resonated so much with the younger generation. It's what they see on TV news. So I encourage you to remind people that it's about humanity. For over 70 years, the JCRC has been the Jewish community's interfaith, interethnic, and public policy arm. We work to build consensus within the Jewish community and then translate these positions into partnership to include the Bureau of Jewish Education. Not every state in our union conducts a statewide ceremony like this, let alone with the participation of our governor and our mayor. The Jewish community is incredibly proud of this event. So first I would like to thank Governor Pence and Mayor Ballard for taking the time to participate with us and share their personal remarks. And also thank Treasurer Burnock, Attorney General Zoller, Senator Tompkins, and other members of our clergy in the audience. Next, I want to acknowledge Clayton Graham and Jamal Smith, two very special individuals who lead organizations that do the critically important work of being ever vigilant in securing and safeguarding the civil rights of all cultures. So now it gives me great pleasure and honor to introduce our governor, Mike Pence, for his remarks, followed by the mayor, Greg Ballard. Thank you.
Thank you, Shelby. Thank you for the leadership and partnership with the Indiana Jewish Community Relations Council, working with the Civil Rights Commission and the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Holiday Commission, as well as the Indianapolis Bureau of Jewish Education. Bring about this important effort. The 16th annual Holocaust Observance and reading of names of the Holocaust. One comes to a moment like this with a great sense of inadequacy, a great sense of humility. Here in Indiana, we remember the loss, remember the sacrifice, courage, and faith. All those that endured this unthinkable moment in history. I do wish to thank Judge Graham, our Attorney General, our Treasurer, members of the General Assembly, members of the clergy, and also members of survivor families who are here and honors each one by their presence. It is believed that the strong man who came to power in Germany once said that conscience was a Jewish invention. Which may well have been why the Nazis sought to annihilate not just the Jewish people, but Judaism itself. Not just a population, but a very source in history of the notion of conscience and truth. In Auschwitz, the notorious doctor, whose name I will not repeat, was fond of saying, quote, "It is not God who decides who will live and who will die, it is I." As if to prove to the world that there was no God, to give the Jewish people their freedom. The Nazis decided to send all of the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto to their deaths in April of 1943, during Passover, the Jewish festival of freedom. For the first time in all occupied Europe, the people then resolved to resist. History records that those Jews decided to fight back. In one of the most courageous acts in the history of mankind, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising held at bay the mighty German army for 47 days. The last of the resistance was finally crushed 71 years ago this morning, April 30th, 1943. It was to commemorate the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising's acts of glorious defiance and hope over death and despair that Yom HaShoah was established this season. The bravery of those people in that moment in history lit a flame of hope and courage in Jewish hearts that has burned ever since. It was that flame that inspired those who fought to establish the State of Israel and those who fight to protect and defend the Jewish state to this day. It was that act which represents, in so many ways, mankind's triumph of hope over despair, of life over death. Today we commemorate Yom HaShoah. We remember victims of the greatest crime of man against man. The greatest crime against the young, the old, the innocent. Against 1.5 million children. 6 million Jewish people. And millions more of those that were considered physically, socially, politically inferior. We remember what happens on this day. When hate takes hold of the human heart and turns that heart into stone. We remember what happens when victims cry for help and no one listens. We remember what happens when humanity fails to see those who are not in our image are still very much in God's image. We remember and pay tribute to the survivors, some of whom are with us today and represented in their families. We remember those who bore witness to this greatest of crimes, so that the victims, those robbed of their very lives, would not also be robbed of their deaths and their memory. We remember and give thanks this day for the righteous of the nations who did save lives. Often at great personal risk, from the American soldier to the volunteer to the generous entrepreneur. We thank them for their example that still echoes through history and new stories. We thank them for teaching us how even one person can change the lives of thousands and create light in the darkest times. Today, in a very real sense, we remember his voice who they sought silence. Who said every generation, do not murder, do not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor, do not oppress the stranger in your midst. While we cannot change the past, we are commanded to know the past so we can change the future. While we cannot bring the lost back, we can ensure in moments like this, as we do here in Indiana this day, that their memories will live on, so that their deaths will not have been in vain. Let us then, as Hoosiers and neighbors, recommit ourselves to the most profound of Jewish acts. Yizkor. Remember. May we never cease to keep fighting the battle of the Warsaw Ghetto Wars for hope over despair, life over death, for love over hate, for peace over terror. Let us in their memory remain true to their faith and be a source of blessing from this day to the world. In Indiana, we will always remember, in large cities and small, in the city and on the farm, that unthinkable act against humanity. We will remember the lives, the loss, but we will remember the courage and the faith of all who endured, for we surely are their witnesses. And so, here in Indiana, we will ever be. So help us God.
together the office holders that are in here, the clergy that are in here, everybody that comes here today. It's quite the day. Judge, thank you for being here. You said something that really stuck with me, which is that we're in a position where you're trying to put yourself out of business. I can tell you that I was in a similar position for 23 years. I believe that everybody who wears a uniform in this country at one point says, I hope I don't have to do this anymore. I wish we were not needed. Unfortunately, I too am sick. That's going to happen anytime soon. Because unfortunately, that's the way it's the whole history. And I think at these times, read the history of all of this, it's just difficult to comprehend as well. I do remember, it's always stuck with me, was when those Allied troops went into those camps. General Eisenhower went in with them. And he went back into the neighborhoods, the cities. He forced the people to come see what had happened. That's a humane person. Even though we always try to make sure we do not repeat our history, even with that unspeakable tragedy, it still hurts. It's very, very recent, and it will occur in the future. I'm optimistic, though. When I look at the crowd here today, I know across the world, more people that come together all the time to speak to each other. And it can be difficult. I've seen so many tragic things in my day. To be frank, it can hurt. When I see people come together, try to eliminate misunderstandings. We are gathered here today to celebrate, remember these events. We're here for each of those lives that was lost in this world time. We're here to remember those people who risked their lives to save the lives of others. We are here to thank the members of the armed forces around the world who brought an end to this. We're here to try, if all possible, to understand what this means in the future of the world. And all of those things matter tremendously. It's a somber occasion. I'm certainly so happy that the video was shown. Because it makes you laugh. Makes you feel. Reading about it is one thing, seeing it is another. I'd like to think that as our nation, we are compelled to help to tell the rest of the world we stand for it. And make sure we go forward. What is right, what is just. Being silent doesn't work. And in today's time, with all the tragedy that's still around us today, it's difficult to rise up sometimes and say, this must stop. We must stop this. There will be a reading of the names there shortly, and I wish you targeted for destruction for racial, ethnic, or national reasons. Millions more homosexuals, prisoners of war, political dissidents, and other religious groups also suffered grievous oppression and death under Nazi tyranny. Whereas the history of the Holocaust offers an opportunity to reflect on the moral responsibilities of individuals, societies, and governments. Whereas the city of Indianapolis remembers the terrible events of the Holocaust and remains vigilant against hatred, persecution, and tyranny. Whereas the city of Indianapolis is dedicated to the principles of individual freedom in a just society and continues to work to promote human dignity and confront hate whenever and wherever it occurs. And whereas in memory of the victims of the Holocaust and in honor of the survivors, rescuers, and liberators, the days of remembrance are observed this year from April 27th to May 3rd. Now, therefore, I, Gregory Ballard, Mayor of the City of Indianapolis, to give our proclaim April 27th to May 3rd, 2014, today's remembrance. Thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight. Please do your part to eliminate misunderstanding and bring people together. So we have to see this much less.
Before we transition to our prayerful moment of remembrance, I want to again thank the mayor for his thoughtful remarks and the governor for his thoughtful remarks.
taking time from your busy day to participate in today's Holocaust Observance ceremony. My name is Tibor Hoffman, and I'm a volunteer speaker for the Bureau of Jewish Education's Holocaust Education Program. I was born in Hungary in 1954, and of course that means that I'm too young myself to be a survivor of the Holocaust, but both my parents were survivors. They didn't talk much about their experiences, especially when I was young. I do remember asking my father about the wound embers crudely tattooed on his left forearm. He simply said the Nazis did that. It wasn't until sometime after he passed away in 1975 that my mother mentioned that my father had been married before the war, and that his first wife and their two young daughters perished in the Holocaust. Your programs in the middle of the top row include a photo of my father and his first wife on their wedding day. After my father passed away, my mother did begin to talk more about her life during the war. At the beginning of the war, Hungary, like Italy, was allied with Nazi Germany. The fascist Hungarian government was not quite as brutal as the Nazis, but living in rural Hungary, my mother and the rest of her family witnessed and experienced the effects of racial laws adopted by the Hungarian government at the beginning of the 1930s. These laws were designed to make life difficult for the Jews, and indeed to humiliate and to dehumanize them. Restrictions and limitations on education and on occupations, restrictions on owning property and on employing non-Jews, and even prohibitions on marrying non-Jews. Once the war started, Jews serving in the Hungarian army, like my Uncle Joe, my mother's oldest brother, were stripped of their ranks and uniforms, and they were reassigned to so-called labor battalions. And over the next few years, other able-bodied Jewish men, like my uncles Louis and Paul, two of my mother's younger brothers, were conscripted into labor battalions to provide slave labor, initially for Hungarian troops, and then later in the war for Nazi troops on the Russian front. The day-to-day lives of even those remaining in their homes was miserable, with shortages of food, clothes, and other essentials. With the accelerating impact and enforcement of anti-Jewish racial laws and what those laws implied about the status of Jews in Hungarian society, and with growing fears about what might come next. Those fears came to be realized in early 1944. The Hungarian government, recognizing that Nazi Germany was losing the war, sought to make peace with the Allies. Nazi Germany reacted by occupying Hungary in March of 1944 and installing a Nazi puppet government. Within days, the Nazis and their Hungarian collaborators began implementing the most brutal of Nazi policies. They began by forcing the remaining Jews from their homes and concentrating them in rural and urban ghettos. My mother and my grandmother and 9-year-old Aunt Kitty were swept up over the next several months in this Nazi-run and Hungarian-administered process. The upper right-hand side of your programs pictures my grandmother and my young aunt around this time. The three of them, with my mother, ended up together with thousands of other Jews in a ghetto and deportation hub in the nearby city of Papa in northwestern Hungary. Meanwhile, my Uncle Alex, my mother's youngest brother, who was then 18 years old, was conscripted into a forced labor battalion himself. Then on July 6, 1944, my grandmother, our uncle, and my young Aunt Kitty, along with my mother, were forced onto railroad cattle cars and deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau and Poland. Their train, stuffed with nearly 2,800 Jews from Papa and the surrounding area, arrived at Auschwitz the next day, Friday, July 7. When they were forced off, My grandmother and my young aunt were directed to the left with the other children and elderly, and my mother was directed to the right with the other able-bodied Jews. I don't think my mother knew at the time the significance of the left and right instructions, but my grandmother and aunt probably were dead before the end of the day. Standing in line by those railroad tracks was the last time my mother saw my grandmother and my aunt. After my mother's group was directed to the right, her head was shaved and her clothes were taken. She and the rest of the group were given rough sackcloth clothes to wear, and that began my mother's stay at Auschwitz. At Auschwitz, my mother and her barracks mates were taken out daily. They were forced to dig and move stones and rocks by hand for a railroad line. The Germans used them as slave labor to further their war efforts. The barracks were very crowded, they lacked sanitation, and they were given very little food and no medical attention. They had no utensils for eating the little food they were given. It was a brutal existence. Nearly every day, one or more of the women died from starvation, disease, beatings, or other abuse. After about 5 weeks in Auschwitz, my mother, along with 86 other women, were taken to the Guben slave labor camp, about 60 miles southeast of Berlin. At Guben, every night my mother worked a 12-hour shift in a munitions or electronics factory. The living conditions were still inhuman, but they were better than Auschwitz. In late 1944, the Soviet Army invaded German territory and was driving toward Guben on their way to Berlin. A month or two later, in February of 1945, as Soviet troops neared Guben, the Nazis forced my mother and the other slave workers to leave on foot. That began a brutal forced march and train journey of some 300 miles in the dead of winter. Many froze to death or were just killed outright along the way. Those who survived, like my mother, arrived several weeks later at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp near Hanover in northern Germany. Anne Frank died at Bergen-Belsen at about the same time my mother arrived there. Just a few weeks later, on April 15, 1945, British troops liberated Bergen-Belsen. They found thousands dead and dying, and thousands died in Bergen-Belsen even after the British liberation. My mother was still alive, just barely. She remained at what became the Bergen-Belsen Displaced Persons Camp for several months, regaining her strength until she returned to Hungary in November of 1945. Upon her return, she found that two of her brothers were alive and had also returned. My mother's youngest brother, my uncle Alex, had been the first to return home at the end of April. He had survived by escaping from his labor battalion, enduring a series of harrowing recaptures and re-escapes, and by hiding in the countryside with the help of a few sympathetic farm families. My Uncle Paul returned a few months after Alex. He had survived concentration and slave labor camps within Hungary. My Uncle Joe, my mother's oldest brother, who had been seriously injured and taken prisoner by the Russians in 1943, was eventually released from a Russian prisoner of war camp in 1946, and he also returned. My Uncle Louis didn't return. The family eventually learned that he had died in Russia while being forced to clear a minefield. Out of the 7 members of my mother's immediate family living right before the war, 4 survived the Holocaust. I don't know as much about my father's family. I do know that he had an older brother, Arpad, who was married, and he had 3 sisters, Rose, Gizush, and Magda. I think their mother, my grandmother, was still alive at the beginning of the war. And as I mentioned, my father was married and had 2 daughters. Out of this group of 10 in my father's immediate family, he was the only survivor. I don't know the details of what happened to them, except that my father's first wife, Yolan, died at Auschwitz, and his brother Arpad was shot in the street in Budapest. My father was liberated from Dachau near Munich in southern Germany by American troops in April of 1945. Between my mother and father's immediate families, 5 out of 17 survived. That was about average for Hungarian Jews in the Holocaust. At the beginning of the war, there were around 800,000 Jews in Hungary out of a total population of about 9 million. The Nazis and their collaborators killed around 500,000 Hungarian Jews, mostly during the last 12 months. This is a staggering statistic. 500,000 murders. That means about 1,350 murders every day for 12 straight months, or one murder nearly every minute. That's the average rate, 7 days a week, day and night, 24 hours a day, at which the Nazis and their collaborators murdered just Hungarian Jews during just the last 12 months. It is for this, for the memories of my family members, for all the Hungarian Jews brutalized and murdered in the Holocaust, and for the memories of the millions of others brutalized and murdered by the Nazis and others who shared their worldview, that we light candles today to represent our promise never to forget them and to express our hope for the understanding, the wisdom, and the strength of character to be able to fulfill our promise of never to forget.
Hallelujah.